This is the Anthropology podcast, hosted by me, Gabby LaPera. Every 2 weeks, I interview a biological anthropologist about what makes us, us. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Anthropology podcast. Joining me here today is Dr. Christian Crowder. I have to pull out my notes. Hold on. Dr. Christian Crowder, forensic anthropologist at the Southwestern Institute of Forensic Sciences, forensic anthropologist associated with the Dallas County ME's office, professor at University of Texas Arlington, University of Texas Southwestern Medical Center, Pace University in New York. That one's online because he's in Texas. And as much as I think he might be magical, I don't think he's actually magical. And on top of that, he does a bunch of review work. Hello, how are you?
Good. I wish I was magical. I could get so much more done.
I don't know that you need to get anything more done. I feel like you're doing plenty. You're making the rest of us look bad.
There are some people out there who are like, why are you doing this podcast? You have things that are due to me. And those people know who they are. And I hope they're not listening.
It's fine. I'll release this in like months and you can be like,
all right.
It only took like 30 minutes, many moons ago. It's fine.
Sounds good.
Welcome to the show. I invited you on for a few different reasons. One, because you actually emailed me after you heard Dr. Janet Andronowski's expert at bone histology podcast, because you've worked with her in the past. Your email was so lovely that I was like, I'm sure Dr. Crowder's lovely as well. And I was like, I want to have you come on. And
I'm so much better in email.
I can say that is definitively not true, having chatted with you for 10 minutes before we actually started recording. You seem really wonderful. Today's just compliment day for Dr. Crowder.
Thank you so much. You're wonderful as well.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. I love that. No, so you have done a lot of different things, but I thought that after you sent me your resume, especially your CV, really, I was like, I have to interview him. He's done so many different things and he's got a lot of interesting perspectives. I guess what I want to do is approach this kind of in the way that your CV approaches it. So one, I would love for you to talk to me about your forensic work, and then we'll talk a little bit about mass fatalities. And then after that, we'll talk a little bit about paper review for the academics who hold on till the very end of this episode.
Sounds great.
Awesome. Yes, because I have noticed that I have like kind of two different audiences, and one is like super into like the academic stuff. Like people write to me and they're like, I had no idea the academic politics, I'm addicted. And then I have other people who are like, wow, I love science. So a little bit of everything for everybody in this show.
And by the way, the reason that I contacted you was because, not because I was trying to say, I don't know what Jana's talking about. It was because y'all had mentioned about the old stick a bone on your tongue in the field.
Yes.
And you're like, why do people do that?
Yes, actually, you know what? Tell people the answer to that. So just background for people. Something that you hear when you're out in the field with archaeologists is that if you find something and you don't know if it's porcelain or bone, you should just lick it. And if it sticks to your tongue, then it's bone. And if it doesn't, it's porcelain. And my opinion is that doesn't sound very sanitary. It just came out of the ground and it could be a body part. What do you say to these archaeologists? Does it actually work?
It does work. Now, you don't want to do this, of course, with decomposed remains or anything that's of potentially medical legal significance that needs to have DNA testing. But prior to DNA, bone is porous. And so if you, if you put liquid on it, then it'll absorb it. If you put it on your tongue, it'll stick. If it's porcelain, liquid slides off it or your tongue will stick to it, or at least not like it would if it was bone. So that's why I contacted you.
And I really appreciate that. So I guess following in the footsteps of Dr. Andronowski's interview, pro tip number one, if you want to determine the difference between bone and porcelain in the field, you can lick it. But the super pro tip is not to lick it at all and just ask someone.
That's right.
Okay, so you are a forensic anthropologist. What is that? What does that mean?
I mean, that's funny that you asked that because I feel like, our field has been struggling with really defining that. And we're really good at saying what we aren't. But over the past couple of decades, there's been quite a bit of work, even the literature about this. And I think it was either 2007 or 2008. Dennis Dirkmatt and colleagues, they have a great article that came out, I think, in the yearbook of physical anthropology that talks about this like paradigm shift that has occurred from physical anthropology to forensic anthropology because there's this and I've actually heard some of the people you have interviewed in some of your other podcasts who are biological anthropologists who use sort of I'm trying to say this in a nice way, kind of an antiquated definition that forensic anthropology is just the application of physical anthropology methodologies in the medical legal setting. And that's not really true anymore. At one point, I think that's what was happening because when the medical legal community was reaching out to someone to help them with an unidentified skeleton or recovering remains from a clandestine burial, they were reaching out to the universities and they were reaching out to bioarchaeologists, people who were trained at excavating and trained at developing these osteobiographies. And that's kind of the birth of the field. But it has become so much more now. And it's not just looking at osteobiographies, it's looking at everything surrounding the circumstances of the death of this individual. What was happening around the time of death, what has happened after death in the post depositional environment. So in that article, that 2007 or 8 article, I think that the definitions like the entire article, like 15 pages or whatever, and then there's a good summary. So if anyone wants to read it, at the very end, they're like, and finally, we're at the definition, and there's a paragraph. So go and find it and read it. It's really good, and that's the long, convoluted explanation of what a forensic anthropologist is. We are basically a support for the forensic pathologist. We're a support for the medical legal death investigators. We help with determining or estimating the biological profile, so age, sex, ancestry, stature. We help with looking at pathological conditions of bone. A big portion of what we do is trauma analysis, which is kind of another shift from bioarchaeology to forensic anthropology, is what we do with trauma, looking at taphonomy and interpreting taphonomy.
What is taphonomy?
So, taphonomy, the kind of broad definition is looking at everything that has happened to the decedent or to the remains once they were deposited into the environment. And so you have an exchange from the body into the environment, and you have an exchange from the environment into the body. And then anything that could happen along the way, if remains are removed by scavengers, if they're recovered incorrectly and damaged, all
Yeah.
of that is a taphonomic events.
Yes, yes. And this is super common. This is super common in the field, both like in the biohistoric arena and in the forensic field, right? Like you have a farmer and he's tilling his field and he's like, oh, damn, here's a skull, but he ran over the rest of the body and now the body's in a million pieces. And you have to figure out, were these cuts to the bone made from the tractor or were they made by the murderer or whatever caused the person to end up there? So it's actually a pretty complicated and very interesting field. One thing that I wanted to ask you is when do you get involved in cases? Like, are you just sitting around in your office, kind of like how I imagine children imagine their teachers in elementary school, like the lights are off and you're just like immobile, like a robot, just waiting for a call? Or like what kind of when do you get involved in the process? And then when you do, what does that look like?
So there's a red phone. No, so, I mean, a good way to talk about this is to kind of describe, for those of us that work in a medical examiner's office or in a coroner's office, The way that our day starts is there's a case list that's generated from the cases that have come in from the previous day over the night. And we basically have a morning rounds, a morning meeting. And this is where the pathologist fellows typically will introduce the cases and assign the cases to the pathologist. So at that point, that's the first place where I start to look at where I may be able to assist. And so a part of it is sort of me being proactive and going making rounds during autopsy and saying, hey, do you need assistance with this? Can I help out with this? Or the pathologist will immediately say, oh, we have a case that's definitely going to be for you because there's not much I'm going to be able to do with it. Or it's a complex case and it's going to need anthropological analyses.
So one thing I just want to insert there is that pathologists deal with the squishy bits. So flesh, organs, all that stuff. But when it comes to bones, they don't have the same sort of training that you do when it comes to interpreting bones, which is why they would call you in on like particular cases.
Right. So, they have skeletal training, but that is our specialty. The core, we're osteologists and we're familiar with all the variants, or we try to be familiar with all the variants. And that's one of the things. If you're a person who works in-house with a pathologist and at autopsy, and this happens frequently, it'll be a pediatric autopsy, and there will be a very strange sutural variant, a suture that just doesn't look, bipartite parietal or something that's just odd. They haven't seen that before. And so they'll call me over and say, I don't think this is a fracture. Is this a fracture? And I'm like, no, this is a suture. So it's a very quick consult. We call those table consults, sometimes tabletop consults. But that's something that, if you're working out of an academic institution, you may not be involved with those type of cases.
Yeah. Yeah. It's kind of, I feel like forensic anthropology is definitely an interesting mix where you do have some people sending out to like the Smithsonian or like their local university, and they just have those kind of like that traditional, this anthropologist actually does something else, but they're trained in osteology. So they come in and like do these like random one-off consults versus what you do, which is very much like you are in the ME's office and you're there a lot.
and that's part of where you're seeing the shift in our field. More positions are opening up for medical examiner offices because they're starting to realize the benefit. It used to be you would talk to a coroner or a medical examiner, and you would say, I think you need a forensic anthropologist, in-house, and be like, no, we only get a few skeletons in the woods a couple times a year. And I'll be like, oh, me too. Most of my work is trauma analysis, and most of it's with fleshed remains, and that always surprises some of these offices that just have never had that type of support, and so they oftentimes don't know how an anthropologist can be integrated into their office. And there's a lot that we can do, not just with autopsy, but with identification.
I mean, that surprises me. What do you do when you have fleshed remains? What are you looking at?
We dissect. So I mean, we work in concert with the pathologist. So to give you an example, with a pediatric remains, if the pathologist is noticing that there's evidence of hemorrhage in the arms, they will dissect the arm. And at that point, we may reflect the muscle further and then expose the periosteum. The periosteum is the connective tissue, that goes over, this is for your readers, not you, but goes over the bone. And what we'll do is we'll dissect and open the periosteum and look at those areas like the metaphysis, where with pediatric cases, especially if a child is shaken or their arm is pulled, you can have separation of that metaphysis or growth plate.
Yes. So for listeners who aren't familiar with babies/children's skeletons, when you're born, you're actually born with more bones than you end up with because all of your bones come in different parts. And then as you grow, they kind of lengthen and then eventually they fuse together. So the sutures that you were talking about earlier, those are in the head, but you can also see sutures on places like the bottom of your femur where it like joins up with the little with the little, I'm making a gesture that looks like breasts, but it's it's just like two little bumps at the bottom.
I knew what you meant.
Yeah, you knew what I meant. But
I need an adult.
so, but no, so there's like a lot of places that you might find sutures, or growth plates, and so that's such an excellent example, and also like the way that children and baby skeletons react to trauma is different than adults, because when you're still growing, the bones are still more like the chemical makeup of the bones is different, correct?
Right, right. Dr. Andronowski went into this a little bit when you all were talking about modeling and remodeling, and for bone to move through tissue space, you have different types of bone. Whereas with adults, you have mature osteon cells, and you have bone turnover. So during growth and development, you have a lot more primary bone, lamellar bone, and you have a higher collagen content. And so that's why, when you hear about like green stick fractures, children have kind of a bending or tearing type fracture, whereas an adult, you just have a transverse fracture.
Yes. Yeah. So if you want to imagine, if you take like a chicken bone and you boil it, you know how it gets super bendy? That's kind of like kids' bones, to be honest. And that's because that you're left with mostly just collagen when you boil the bone like that.
Mm.
I actually did a lab with that for a little bit before people were like, please stop doing this.
Now, people, don't go home and bend your kids' bones, please.
Yes, although children are bouncier, this is not a good idea to experiment on your children. Right. So you do a lot of work like day to day with the ME's office. Can you tell us about a case that you've worked on, kind of like start to finish, like when they called you on, the kinds of analysis you did, the results that the case had?
Sure, sure. One of the cases when I worked for the city of New York at the OCME there, we had a potential child abuse case where we were called in about trying to take X-rays through a small tub filled with concrete. And we were told that there were remains of an infant in there. And at this time, I can't remember the actual age. And so we took X-rays and couldn't really see anything. And so it was decided, well, we need to open it. And so we took some pneumatic chisels and tried to create a little fault line, and ended up being able to separate it into two halves. And we basically had an infant, and we had two molds on either side. And you can even tell in looking at the remains that there looked like there was potentially a callus on the humerus on the upper arm. So it looked like it had probably been broken, and then you had some exuberant bone formation, enough of it to where it would have been visible, recognizable on the surface because of the bulge in the skin. And it was actually showing up in the cast as well. And so we do what we do, and we process the remains after autopsy, which means that we macerate or remove the soft tissue so we can get a better view of the hard tissue, the skeleton. And this case had significant fractures, healing fractures, differential healing fractures, meaning we had old fractures, we had newer fractures, but all of them were in a state of healing except for a fracture to the cranium. So we had an acute fracture, which it would be very important to the pathologist because this would tie in likely to their cause and manner of death. And that's what we do to try to help them come to those conclusions. And we also had multiple rib fractures. And so we had evidence of multiple traumatic events that happened with this child. And then it was encased in concrete. Story unfolded, and I'm not going to go into the entire story, but it turns out that this concrete block was also used to sort of terrorize other children in the house. That, well, if you're bad, you might end up in the concrete block. And this block was in a place in the house where it was kind of displayed. So it was just a very, very odd and sick case. but also just anthropologically extremely interesting to see all this exuberant bone formation and the amount of fracturing and refracturing that likely happened. And then around this time, we were also experimenting with sort of making our own casts for either training or just for evidentiary reasons, making casts of items. And we actually used that block and made I guess another infant out of something that was called dragon skin. And it was amazing because you could actually see the skin folds, the wrinkles, you could see the injuries. And anytime anyone comes to the office, that's one of the cases that we pull out. And it's just such an interesting and also horrible case.
Yeah. And that's, I think, something worth noting is that when you work in forensics, it's not like when you do historical bioarchaeology, right? When you're doing historical bioarchaeology, everyone has been dead for a really long time for the most part. Like minimum 100 years really is what we're talking about here. Most of the people who knew those people are dead. It's more of a historical interest, as opposed to you are dealing with someone's traumatic death and they have people who knew them and loved them and cared about them. Although, unfortunately, for this child, it doesn't actually sound like that was necessarily the case, which is also super troubling. But it's one of those things where it's like, that this is happening now.
Right.
And that immediacy can be, I'm sorry, I'm not speaking for you. It was tough for me to deal with when I was still in anthropology because I mostly did bioarchaeological stuff, but every once in a while I'd be asked to help out with something forensic, and I'd be like, I don't know. There's no words. It's definitely something that you have to learn how to deal with.
Right. And, usually you're so focused on what you're doing in your analysis and realizing that not only is there the aspect of bringing someone who potentially has done something to justice, but also in a case like this where you have children, there's concern that there might be other children in this household. And so what you do has bearing on potentially what happens with those children. And so you just have to, kind of keep all these things in balance when you do this type of work.
Yeah. Yeah. That sounds really hard. Maybe one day I'll do a whole podcast about mental health in forensics because I think it's something that we don't actually talk about that much, but that is not why I brought you here.
Right.
So don't worry.
Is this an intervention? Why is my family behind you? No.
It would be wild if they flew from Texas and they're all standing behind me here in San Francisco. But no, so I actually, let's drill in a little bit deeper into forensic anthropology and what you do. And one of the things that you research a lot is histology.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was wondering, one, can you give another definition for histology, just in case someone didn't listen to Dr. Andronowski's, again, very fabulous episode. Can you tell the listeners, what is histology?
An easy way to say it is histology is just looking at bone at the microscopic level. I mean, that's the most simplistic way to approach it. Most of what we do in anthropology is at the gross level, not like sick, but macroscopic analysis. And we're trained that way. We're trained kind of with gross analysis. We get some training with radiography or nowadays even more like CT and MRI and things like that. And histology is just another way to look at bone. I've always taken a multi-modality approach to my analyses, and I try to pair all of those modalities to glean as much information as I can. And I think a lot of times in forensics, we take that approach partly because in pathology, they do the same thing. That's how they're trained. They do histopathology. During autopsy, they section all the organs. They take sections of skin, whatever they need to look at under a microscope, and they make diagnoses. And so we can kind of do the same thing using hard tissue histology.
It's just a deeper slice.
That's right.
It's a histology pun. I'm sorry.
Where's the rim shot? You can edit that in later.
Okay. I don't think I have the skills to do that, but I'll think about it for sure. Yes. So how do you use, we talked a lot about like the research kind of angles that Dr. Andronowski was taking with histology. How do you do kind of like the practical application of
Okay.
histology in forensic anthropology? Like if you were to go into the lab and you're like, okay, I'm going to use histology today to do this analysis, what would you be doing with that analysis? Like what kind of analysis would it be?
Okay. There's probably two main areas that most anthropologists have had some sort of introduction to, or at least some experience with. One of those is using bone histology to help determine human versus non-human. And usually what they're looking for in that is what's called, plexiform bone, which is kind of a non-osteonal bone. And depending on the type of plexiform bone or fibrolamellar bone, it can kind of look like bricks. And so you can, if you have a fragment that has no gross diagnostic features, you look at it under the microscope and you might easily be able to differentiate. Now, the problem is other mammals have osteons. I wish we were the only ones with osteons. It would make it so much easier. And so there are some metric methods, and Dr. Victoria Dominguez and myself have worked on some methods with trying to take osteon area, osteon diameter, and really comparing. The difficulty is there's so much overlap, just like with most human variation or even mammalian variation. There's a lot of overlap, but you do see trends with non-humans tending to have smaller osteons. And so
Interesting.
that's one application for bone histology.
Honestly, too, people in bioarchaeology can use this because say you've stumbled upon a midden and your archaeologist has licked a bunch of pieces that he found in it. A midden is fancy. It's a fancy way of saying trash heap. It's an old trash heap. And your archaeologist has licked a bunch of pieces of it and is like, this is, I'm really hating on the archaeologist today.
Sticking, so
They're like, this sticking, but look, it's very tiny. And I don't know. It's definitely bone, but I don't know whose bone it is. Like you can potentially use this to be like, this belongs to a fish, or belongs to another mammal at least, so that's definitely a really interesting use right there. That's something that's super cool. So if you're still interested in bioarchaeology, but for forensics,
yeah.
you would be shocked by how many times people show up to forensic anthropologist's office and they're like, I think that I found human remains, and you're like, these are not human. That happens a lot.
Oh, it happens a lot. And probably a good portion of some of the work that we all do is just making that simple identification. And a lot of times we'll do it via photographs. So no one makes a crime scene, no one works a crime scene, or no one has to transport remains, or we don't have to send the crew out there to get remains. But yeah, that we do that quite often. And usually I would say 99% of the time, gross morphology you can tell right away, especially when there's horns. When there's horns, it's very easy, and I'm probably 100% accurate with that.
I will say that one interesting thing that happened when I was at the Smithsonian that would happen like on a semi-regular basis is people would just like literally send bones in the mail. And we would open a package and we'd be like, cool, someone sent us an entire turkey.
There was one time in New York, we received a package from Rikers, the prison there, and it was a book. And you open up the first, like chapter or whatever, and then all of a sudden there was a cutout square, and inside it was a bone. And there was a letter from an inmate thinking that the prison guards were killing people, and it ended up being an oxtail. Like oxtail soup or whatever.
Oh,
but it
no.
was one of the weirdest non-human requests that we had ever received.
That's a really good one, honestly. I think the most common one that I hear, especially on the East Coast, is bear paws. Especially when they become disassociated, like they've been scavenged and like the little claws are gone. So bear paws look super human, actually. Like shockingly human.
Right.
So I think that was one of the more common ones that we would find, like especially out in West Virginia and stuff like that.
Right.
Want to hear a super dumb joke?
No, let's hear it.
Okay. All right. So this giant bear walks into a bar and he tells the bartender, can I have a rum and Coke? And the bartender's like, sure, but what was with the big paws? And he goes, I'm a bear. Got big paws. Sorry. Anyway, what were you gonna say before I interrupted with that?
I don't know.
Intellectual gem.
Oh no, being back in Texas, a lot of times it's deer, pig. I mean, you can usually guess what it's going to be. Occasionally, you'll get something weird. Yeah, usually if I look at it, I'm like, I have no idea what this is. It's probably aquatic or a reptile or something. But it does keep you on your toes sometimes. But histology.
One last thing about that is that if you do find animal bones and you're like, I don't know what to do with this, but I really need them identified, there is such a thing as a zooarchaeologist, and zooarchaeologist is zooarchaeologist, but pronounced in the Latin way. But they are incredible. Like, you take them like a tiny little like 1/4-inch piece of bone and they're like, oh, this is clearly from like a juvenile raccoon. And you're like, how do you know? But they know. It's incredible. Joanne Bowen.
Sometimes people get really annoyed with me because they'll be like, hey, doc, what is this? I'm like, I don't know. It's not human. Like, well, how do you know if you don't know what it is?
It's like,
I just know.
It's like, I don't have to know that it's what it is to know that it's not human, because I know what humans look like.
That's what I say. But apparently I need to take a few more Zoart classes because I'm losing it.
Yeah. So my undergraduate thesis advisor, her name was Dr. Joanne Bowen, and she worked at in Colonial Williamsburg.
Okay.
Which is a very interesting place. That's for another time. But she is one of these brilliant, brilliant people that can just look at tiny pieces of bone and be like, yes, a scute is a type of scale that comes from fish. The things you learn on this show. Right? So histology and forensic anthropology.
Right. So
we can figure out if they're animals, and
right. So it's an animal, or it's not, or whatever. But if we have human remains and all of the typical age indicators that we use just aren't available, or they're damaged, then bone histology can be used to estimate age. And this is a good portion of my research. My dissertation was looking at histological age estimation. And, essentially you take a bone section usually it's from the anterior femur midshaft or the 6th rib midshaft, and you section it, and then you basically just count the osteons and you plug it into various equations, and you get an age estimate, which usually is, again, very large because it's human variation, and adult age estimation is not extremely accurate, but it's better than having nothing.
Yeah, certainly. I think that this is something that we've definitely touched on the show before, is that a lot of age estimates are based on those macroscopic traits that people have, right? So like, are there sutures done closing? What state of eruption are their teeth in? Stuff like that. So even when you have the whole skeleton, it can still be hard to pin it down once people are past like 25 to 30, because that's kind of when the last bone fuses. So honestly, yeah.
Once you enter into that whole, wear and tear criteria, there's so many intrinsic and extrinsic factors that just create noise. It's hard, and histology is no different. Sometimes in the early literature, it almost sounds like, well, now we have histology, and it's so exact. And just because you count something and you can calculate something doesn't necessarily mean it's more accurate or it's more objective. And those, sometimes you get kind of into this wormhole thinking that you're more objective just because you're doing metric analysis. So you have to just be careful of that. And histology is not really any different. The other area that is probably less used in anthropology is looking at trauma through bone histology. And I tend to do this with pediatric cases where we have a need to try to determine if there's differential healing. And if I process the remains or macerate the remains to where we have no soft tissue, I may not be able to tell grossly if there's a difference in healing because the timing of the injuries just may be too close together. But at the histological level, we might see early healing in one area and no healing in another that hasn't really manifested at the macro level yet. And plus, I'll look at this with the pathologist, and they're looking at cellular response. And they're looking at, is there hemosiderin staining to see if there's very early inflammation and all the things that they look for. And then I'll come in and say, oh, look, there's some osteoid being put down, or oh, look, there's some woven bone. And so it's kind of a joint venture into some of these kind of more difficult trauma cases.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Is there anything about histology that you'd like to say that I haven't asked you about yet?
Don't be put on the spot. I don't know.
Okay.
I don't think so.
Okay. Well, in that case, I think I want to go from very, very small to one of your other specialties, which is mass fatalities, which is a lot of people who have died, maybe not all at once, but they're all buried together, probably died at a similar time. Tell me, why did you start being interested in this? What is your experience in mass fatalities?
Okay. Yeah, it seems weird to see like I wouldn't say it's a specialization. It's more of a just I've been in offices where it's been a necessity. And I think if you look at some of the trends over the past decades of what has happened as far as human rights violations, large mass fatality events, there's been a not even just a trend in anthropology, but just for nations to try to develop ways to handle these. Within anthropology, I think a lot of people from my generation sort of cut their forensics teeth. I don't know if that's a proper way to say it, by working with some of the United Nations work in either Rwanda or Kosovo, East Timor. You had these events, and then they pulled this large international group of people, and you kind of learned real time how to deal with these very large death events. And it could be over a longer period of time. And you're not only dealing with identification issues, but also collecting evidence for whoever, if it's the International Criminal Tribunal or whoever is wanting this evidence. And so I think you had sort of that happening. And then you had 9/11 and Katrina. You had, an earlier Trade Center bombing, the Oklahoma City bombing, and it became obvious that there wasn't enough preparedness that was happening at the local levels. The medical examiner offices or the medical legal community often wasn't integrated into responses, and sometimes not even integrated into some of the aspects of ID. And so all that started to change, especially after 9/11, you had a lot of federal funding, Homeland Security funding that was being used by offices to start developing these mass fatality plans. And the thing about a mass fatality event is it doesn't necessarily have to be a large number of decedents. It can be, if it's a very small jurisdiction, it could be an event that involves 5 people. But if the event exceeds their resources, if they have a small office where they have, 2 pathologists, that can cause the need for them to get jurisdictional help or reach out and have, or if it's, an event where you have high fragmentation. So you might have just a few individuals, but if everyone's fragmented completely, that's a very complex scene now.
Right. And it's not like with paleoanthropologists where they find one skeleton and even though it's in 2000 bits, it doesn't matter because they have 5 years to look at it before they have to publish something. Like you need to get through that faster.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Because almost like sometimes with CRM work, you might have okay, we need you to clear this site, in X amount of time because we need to get things back to normal.
Right, right. You have to go through quite a lot of stuff. Um, so you help develop operating procedures for different groups for mass fatalities. What are some of the things that anthropologists need to think about when they're headed to a mass fatality event?
So, anthropologists are used in many different ways. And I think probably when anthropologists who haven't done this type of work before, they probably could see themselves working maybe somewhere in the morgue where they're maybe helping to do like radiographic ID, or maybe they're helping processing remains to do like a biological profile, kind of the classic anthropological work.
Hmm.
And then you also have people who are trained in forensic archaeology, and they would be, deployed, assisting with the recovery, depending on what type of recovery it is. They might be excavating or mapping. So they have skills that can integrate into a lot of operational areas.
Yeah, this is actually something that I don't think I've ever mentioned on this show, but law enforcement has varying degrees of ability when it comes to actual archaeology. So, especially when they find some kind of site where things are buried, ideally they have training and they know to call an anthropologist, slash they have an anthropologist to call in to help them excavate the remains. Sometimes that doesn't happen. I've actually heard of police officers using a backhoe to excavate a site, which is a terrible idea because you end up losing a ton of bones and teeth and stuff that could be evidence and associated with the case, slash you can damage things. So that's definitely something that you might have to think about, and especially in a mass fatality event, but even just like in a regular run of the mill, quote unquote, forensic case, like
Yeah, I mean, especially in a mass fatality event, there's a tendency for law enforcement and for first responders to shut that scene down. And you're not needed. We're going to take care of this. It's a high profile scene. And so this is where it takes an office having a plan. They've trained to the plan. They've already integrated with first responders prior to this. And so you're not going somewhere for the first time and, hey, I'm so and so, and I'm going to help, I'm going to do this. They already know what your capabilities are, and you've already taught them how to utilize you. And, anthropologists at a scene are very good at scene management. They're very good if there is excavations going on. And you know what? It might happen with the backhoe, but if you have an anthropologist, archaeologist there, that can monitor how that backhoe is operating, it can be done that way. And we're very good at soil management. We're good at understanding site formation. And those are the things where we can direct the search activities.
my question for you is, one of the things that we've talked a lot about on the podcast lately is how do we get people who are not in the sciences or who are not in anthropology, how do we explain what we do to them in a way that's understandable to them and in a way that makes it easier for them to relate to us and for us to relate to them? Like, how do you go about building those relationships? How do you go about, giving people this knowledge in a way that isn't alienating? I know that's a big question, but especially
Right.
in something like the medical legal context, like I think that's a very big thing.
Yeah, I mean, it takes a lot of patience, and it takes a lot of face time and going to these meetings where it's, all these first responders, and you may not be listened to, and maybe, or even going to drills. I've gone to drills where, we're going to practice an air mishap, and the fire department comes out, they roll out all the jaws of life, and they cut things up and they practice things. Police practice, crime scene comes out, practice things. And then, there's 20 minutes left in the operation. They'll say, okay, ME's office, why don't y'all come in and do your thing? You just kind of have to deal with that, and just baby step and work with them and show them the importance of what you're doing and how it's not only going to help the families, but how it's going to help them get that site cleared and get it cleared to where they don't have to come back, or you won't have multiple fines after that site is cleared. I did air quotes in case
Yeah.
cleared air quotes.
Yeah, no, because I mean, also having to come back to a site, one, that's time and money, which is a super cold way to look at it. But two, it can be a problem because then you don't understand necessarily how the evidence is related to each other, especially if you left the crime scene, opened it back up to other people, and then someone else finds something there. Like, that's terrible. That makes it much harder to make your case later that all of that evidence is associated.
Yeah. And there's a mutual respect.
Hmm.
The law enforcement has jurisdiction on the scene or whatever first responders, depending on the type of incident, it'll be either police, it'll be fire, it might be a joint or unified command. And so just learning how to integrate into that is what really helps us operate at the scene, which having someone at the scene that can do that helps with morgue operations because if we can resolve issues in the scene, whether it's commingling or mixing of body parts or potential ID issues where you recognize someone sees a wallet next to a body and they put that wallet in the body bag. Well, that's a disassociated piece of evidence. So putting that in that body bag might now cause that person to have a tentative ID they wouldn't have had. And that may be a good thing, it may be a bad thing, but it needs to be documented of how that happened because once those remains get to the morgue, it can get a bit complicated. And that's why at the morgue, it's often good to have an anthropologist in the station we call triage, which this happens not in everyday morgue operations, but in a disaster morgue operation, you might have different stations. And one of those would be where you triage remains, you assign case numbers to it, things like that.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. And depending on the situation too. So for example, one of the things that happened in Katrina is that you had both fatalities from Katrina and then the flooding caused a lot of buried bodies to resurface. This is something that unfortunately happens like not with some infrequency in the South, especially. And so you had to figure out like, has this person been dead for 100 years? I mean, and that's sad and we should treat them with respect. Or did they die because of Katrina and like someone is looking for them right now? So even that can be a component of the triage as well.
Right. And you have the opportunistic people who commit homicides and try to mask it with a mass fatality event.
That is wild. I had never even thought about that. Um, wow, my mind is really blown. Yeah, kids, come listen to this podcast. Learn how to how to commit murder and get away with it. Except not
What you do.
because Dr. Crowder will catch you. He'll be like, no, this didn't happen because of the mass fatality event. This was special. Um, okay, so I'm gonna just switch focus because we're running out of time because you have a whole life that does not involve me to get back to. Um, so one of the things, amongst the many things that you do, is that you are a manuscript reviewer for the American Journal of Physical Anthropology, and then you're also on the editorial board for the Journal of Forensic Sciences.
And the Journal of Forensic Anthropology.
Oh, and the Journal of Forensic Anthropology. Thank you. Because 2 was not enough. What is that? What is that like? What does that mean?
I mean, basically, it means that I am in an appointed position where I do peer reviews or I help with the process of assigning peer reviews for manuscripts that come in for publication.
Yeah. So when you are looking for a peer reviewed journal, you're the peer.
Yes.
Well, one of them. One of the
Or
peers.
yeah, right. I'm one. Yeah, right.
Yeah.
One of the peers. Or I'm the person who helps direct the paper to people who either have a specialty that whatever the manuscript is focused on, this person would be a great peer reviewer, or it's just this person's a really good peer reviewer and they can take on whatever subject matter.
So as a peer reviewer, what are some things that you wish you could tell authors? I know that you get to tell them in your comments, but like, what are some things that you wish you could tell people before they submitted to you?
Right. So, the common things that come up, one is know your audience. And if you're submitting a manuscript to the Journal of Forensic Sciences, you need to make sure that if your audience is a forensic anthropologist, that you're focusing on research that is germane to what we do. And it also may mean that whatever reference sample you're using is a reference sample that would be applicable to the populations that we deal with. So sometimes we have manuscripts that really are more suited for maybe the American Journal of Physical Anthropology. It's more of like a bioarchaeology rather than a forensic anthropology focus.
Yeah, this is actually the idea of samples is really interesting because one of the things that I've talked about with a few different researchers on the show is people who do forensic research on collections that are historic. And it's like the human body has changed since then, like group
Mhm.
norms have changed. And so you can't look at skeletons that are 100 years old and be like, yep, we can apply this to modern populations, no problem.
Right, exactly. And then forensic populations are very interesting. They tend to be marginalized people. At least one subset is. Then you have the other side of who may be people who car accidents, things like that. So we get a very cross-cultural section of populations, and it makes it difficult to apply reference samples sometimes.
Certainly. I also love that you started with know your audience because I don't know if you know this, but in my day job, I'm an editor. Um, and that is one of the number one reasons that I reject tests from writers in a very different field, but they write stuff in just like a super, I work in personal finance, but they'll write super unempathetic things like, you would be rich if you just stopped drinking lattes from Starbucks. I'm like, get out of here with that. I don't want to hear that. But no, it totally applies to this as well.
The other thing a lot of times is the research design, pairing the research design with the hypotheses. And then when you get to sort of the end of the paper, you feel like, well, this research design doesn't really match what they are trying to do here, or somehow it deviated into something. And that's something that sometimes is fatal for a manuscript, because you can't tell someone, hey, go back and redo this research. So, as you're developing these things, just be very careful with what your hypotheses are. And is your research design going to address those hypotheses? I mean, that's like standard, like research 101, but it's very easy sometimes to just kind of get lost through the analysis.
Yeah, no, that totally, I mean, that, like I said, real life editor, that happens in stuff that I get all the time and it's much lower stakes. It's like a credit card review. And I'm like, I gave you a list of things to cover and they're not covered. Like you're drawing conclusions from things that aren't there, that the evidence doesn't support. Sometimes I drive my colleagues crazy with the way I phrase things. And this is something else that I have learned as like I don't know how to say this, as a real world editor, as a non-academic editor,
Right.
is that real world writers are very sensitive in a way that academic writers cannot be, because reviewers can be really tough. Like they will circle things
Right.
and be like, wrong, see Andronowski 2018. And you just have to like suck it up and be like, damn, I was wrong and I've got to go like double check. Sometimes the reviewer's wrong too, but like,
Right.
you end up having to have kind of like that thicker skin in academia that you don't necessarily get in the rest of the writing, editing world.
Yeah, and sometimes when I review, I'll do my first one, which is where I just like spew things, and then I read it, I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm being such a jerk, and then I'll rework it and whatever. But sometimes you just have to like get it out, because you read something, you just get like animated and angry or happy or whatever.
Yep. No, that
Then
is
you strip all that out.
Yep. That is exactly I like watch my coworkers edit and they're so calm the entire time. And I'm like, how are you so calm? And I'm like, we're writing about personal finance stuff. Like, this is not high stakes at all. But I'm like, how are you not mad? Because I am mad.
No, I'll have people like come in. What's going on? I'm like, I'm reviewing a paper. Leave me alone.
You hear that, everyone? Dr. Crowder gets mad when he reviews your papers. Do better.
Oh,
No, but sometimes you get really excited too, right? Like sometimes you get something and you're like, this is so brilliant. I never would have thought of this
yeah.
myself. Like it completely changes my point of view on something. That's really
Yeah, like I'm
exciting.
lifting this.
Mm-hmm. 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 Absolutely.
But this, the thing with the research design, it could be something as simple as where's your control specimen? That
Mm-hmm.
happens so many times. They've done this amazing project. There's no control. And for someone in my field, that's very difficult. And we have trouble applying methods like that didn't have a control. Same thing with observer error. If they didn't do any type of observer error analysis, or they say, next we're going to do this, well, now we can't apply that. And so it's not a useful method for us as a practitioner unless you give us the tools to utilize your method or concept or whatever.
Right. Right. So, listeners, if you're listening to this and you're like, what should I do before I write my next paper? One, make sure your research design is on lock. Two, know your audience. Three, maybe start with an outline. That wasn't Dr. Crowder's suggestion, that was mine, but it helps a lot. And here's one other free suggestion for you coming from a professional editor. Sometimes the hardest thing to write is the intro. So, what you can do is just not write the intro. You just go ahead and write your entire paper. Whatever your conclusion is, a lot of times you can take that and make it your intro and then rewrite the conclusion at the end. That's kind of that's kind of
Right.
the suggestion that I have for a lot of people who have just a really hard time starting. It's going to be a lot easier to start with your materials and methods because you know what those are. Like it's a lot easier to start with that section than it is to start with an intro. That can feel very overwhelming.
And one of the things that really bothers me are what I call garbage sentences or garbage terms. And that's when you get to the discussion and they go through, okay, so the correlation was a weak correlation, therefore there must be population differences. That's a garbage statement unless you have really addressed that. Have you looked at Jana's head will explode when I say, have you looked at the bone biology? What is the bone biology behind this? If the paper lends itself to that type of critique, but I want to know what's going on with this, really get into the interpretation. And too many times the interpretation of the data is just a bit too superficial. And it just needs to get that final push. But if you start to say, well, there's a lot of variation, and if we did this on another population, it might work out better, or oh, there's sex differences. Be careful when you throw that out there because you may just have trashed a really good paper by ending so vague.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, have some kind of opinion. Hopefully, by the end of it,
Right.
that's definitely the ideal. And sometimes that opinion is because this is science. Is sometimes it's like, yes, our study bears out what these other people have found, and that's also a really valuable point of information that gets discounted sometimes because people are like, oh, I didn't find anything new. That's okay because we need people to test methods over and
Right.
over again to make sure that they're accurate.
Negative results are good. And it's a shame that more journals don't accept that as much. Or
Mm-hmm.
even, if your dissertation or thesis or whatever has a negative result, oftentimes like, oh my gosh, I don't know. That negative results are good
Yeah, it's
and they
still a
help
result.
foster research. Right. It's a result.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Um, we clearly have a lot to talk about when it comes to writing, but I want to ask you about what you have been reading.
Okay.
So, if someone wants to learn more about the kind of work you do, where is a good place for them to start? Someone who's kind of a beginner.
So my recommendation is there's two different levels that you can kind of go for. One is the more textbook, more science approach and structured approach. And there's some really good textbooks out there now that are, intro to forensic anthropology. One of them, I think you interviewed Dr. Bartlink, Eric Bartlink, Angie Christensen, and Nick Pasalacqua. They have an introduction book, very good. Maria Teresa Trissini Tarrant, and that's a hard one to say. We just call her MT. And Natalie Langley, they have a really good intro book. So, both of those for, the person, the lay person that's out there or the student that's out there, and you're trying to assess a textbook, look to see who the authors are, and also look to see if they're board certified forensic anthropologists, because that's going to give you someone who has street cred. They know what they're talking about. They have that quality assurance certification, and it's probably going to be a pretty accurate piece of work. Now, on the other side of it, sort of more of the fun reading would be like Dead Man Do Tell Tales by
William Maples. That is a very
right.
popular recommendation.
I mean, it gives you that little bit of science, a little bit of crime scene novel, with real cases.
Mhm.
Excellent book. Dr. Ubelacher with Bones. That's one that I read as an undergrad, and it really excited me about the field. So any of those, kind of case study type books that are written in an easier type of format to consume are great.
Definitely. What are you reading for work right now?
So right now for work, usually each year I purchase like one or two new textbooks. I'm a little bit behind. I'm going to blame COVID like everyone else is, but I'm reading Sex Estimation of the Human Skeleton, History, Methods, and Emerging Techniques by Dr. Clales. So this is one of the ones that I actually purchased at sort of the end of last year, and I'm kind of slowly trudging my way through it.
It's funny because that was actually a recommendation from Sean Tallman for an intro to his area of study.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I mean, it's a really good, so far it's a really good book, and I can't tell you what's going to happen at the end, but
It is a
I like it so
textbook,
far.
just to be clear.
It is a textbook,
It's
but that's how I tend to. Everyone's like, "What are you reading?" It's a textbook, but I don't know. I like reading textbooks. I
No, I
find them
think that's
fun.
wonderful, but you made it sound like there was a
I
plot that you
know.
were following.
Well, it makes it more enjoyable to read. Um, I'm also going through a lot of cognitive bias articles. A few years ago, I did a study that was part of an NIJ grant where we looked at cognitive bias. And in the past couple of years, we've seen kind of a shift from the crime lab side, more bench scientists. There's been a lot of work with cognitive bias and how they do their analyses and how they are able to sort of limit the effects of various types of bias. And now we're starting to see that on what we call our side of the house, like medical examiner, forensic anthropology, medical legal death investigations. And so we're trying to get this paper put together. So I've been trying to read more about cognitive bias in the forensic sciences.
So you don't have to answer this if you don't want to, but Dr. DeGangi and Dr. Bethard's letter to was it in the Journal of Forensic Sciences, the original one?
I believe so, yeah.
What did you think of that?
So this is the letter that's addressing ancestry.
Yes. Sorry, this is a letter that addresses ancestry estimation, looking at macromorphoscopic traits to determine ancestry estimation. One of their problems with that being that some of those haven't been like scientifically tested rigorously. But then the other half of it being the potential for bias to be introduced into like the rest of the medical legal investigation if you provide that to law enforcement officers that don't have the same understanding and background in anthropology that we do.
Right. So on the science side of that, I think there is, a lot of validity in their argument. And there was a counter letter as well to that. And they also made good arguments. So, I'm kind of in the middle of this, being a forensic anthropologist who works in a medical examiner's office. I am kind of in the middle of this, and we tend to be very cautious with how we approach that assessment because it's a very difficult assessment to do. But using non-metric traits has some issues. And, that's not to say that those traits could be tested further. They could be looked at more in an evolutionary framework and try to understand, their origins better. And so I kind of fall in the middle where I'm very aware of the issues with that. Now, as far as the other side with biasing, bias is always an issue in our field, especially when you go out to the scene and you step out there and a police officer is like, "Well, we think this is," and I'm like, "La la 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 la," don't tell me, don't say anything. When we provide information to law enforcement, we're very cautious. We're aware that if we're incorrect with this analysis, that it could have ramifications in the identification of this individual. But I think they go a little bit further than I would as far as how often things get derailed. I mean, it's hard to know because we don't have a lot of evidence pointing to inaccuracies. Because a lot of times, if it's sort of confusing, I'll put indeterminate. I'm getting conflicting results. I'm just going to make it indeterminate because, like they say, I don't want it to bias
Hmm.
the potential police investigation into something.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's a really interesting conversation that's happening in forensic science right now. Um, I interviewed them a couple weeks ago, and I've just been sitting and thinking about it ever since. Especially because I quote unquote grew up in a lab where we totally did all of those things, and I've never questioned it. You know what I mean? And like, yeah, like I think that we were pretty cautious, and like we would put indeterminate if we didn't know, but um I don't know if everyone does that. And I think that that's like part of what their paper is like trying to bring up. And going back to that component of talking to people, talking to, like the medical legal community that you kind of exist in, and helping them understand your methods and like what they mean and like how to go about doing them. I think that's also just a huge component of it, just like that science communication bit.
I mean, the other part of that is there's this idea that we need to, teach law enforcement, what do I mean by this term? And, not to be callous or anything, but they're not concerned with that. They're very focused and very busy with, homicide detectives, typically have a very crushing caseload. And so they're not interested in if you want to have discussion with them about the social concept of race versus ancestry versus population affinity. They're just going to say, "Doc, just tell me, what am I searching for?"
Hmm.
So I don't necessarily agree that we need to have these broad intellectual academic conversations with law enforcement explaining our results. I think we just need to be clear in our results with what we're saying
Mm. Yeah.
and leave it at that because they're not going to be receptive to that,
Yeah.
to having those conversations.
I have never worked in that context, so I have no idea. But I think that one of the things that kind of stood out to me is that there's not a standard that's set kind of at, there's no universal standard that is set for forensic anthropologists, that says like, hey, if you're not sure, and that's also hard to say, like, how unsure do you have to be? Do you have to be 10% unsure, 15%? Like what, and how do you come up with those percentages to begin with? But that could potentially be a place to start.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very complex analysis, and I think there are possibly some people out there that might use a program like Fordisk and basically put numbers in and look at the result and just take that result and put it into a report. That's more of an issue with a person not doing an analysis and interpretation properly rather than it necessarily being an issue with this concept of being able to determine or estimate population affinity.
Hmm.
So there's a lot of things that are going on there, and it is important that we do kind of fix the issues that people have with analysis and interpretation.
Yeah.
And like you said, like trying to give some sort of guidelines that it's hard.
It's really hard. Want me to ask you the last question? This one's a lot easier.
Okay.
What are you consuming for fun right now?
Fun right now. So I have an intern who just finished reading a book in one of her anthropology classes, undergraduate anthropology classes, and it's brought it over here. So I remember I Remember Julia,
Mm-hmm.
Voices of the Disappeared, and so it sort of follows the abduction of a young woman during the Argentina Dirty War. And so I just started that one, but she said it was a really excellent book, and so thought I'd read that. Other than that, I'm really just I've got a 8.5-year-old and a 6-year-old, and I just spend as much time outside with them. I'm also trying to read how to code in Minecraft because they're super into Minecraft, and so I'm trying to figure out. They watch YouTube videos. And they're like, I want to know how to make that. And so I'm like, all right, I'm going to have to learn how to code now so I can create these things.
You sound like a great dad.
I just want to play Minecraft.
All right. Well, thank you very much for joining us. I really appreciate it. You've been a hoot and holler, as I imagine, would say in Texas, because they say it in Virginia.
We always say that here in Texas.
And you are welcome to come back on the show anytime.
Appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for joining me for this episode of the Anthrobiology Podcast. If you have questions or comments, you can reach me at gabby.lapera@anthrobiology.com. That's spelled GABY.LAPERA@anthrobiology.com. This show is produced by me. Music courtesy of Chad Crouch, aka Poddington Bear at Sound of Picture.